No Ordinary Time. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II, by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Introduction. On a tense night in May of 1940, with the world holding its breath, the President of the United States performed a quiet ritual to help himself fall asleep. He would close his eyes and imagine himself as a boy again, back at his family home in Hyde Park, New York. He'd picture himself standing at the top of a steep, snow-covered hill, his sled in hand. And then, he would push off. In his mind, he felt the rush of wind, the acceleration down the familiar slope, maneuvering every curve with perfect skill. When he reached the bottom, he'd turn around, pull the sled behind him, and begin the slow, steady climb back to the top. Over and over, he would replay this scene, a simple memory of a boy and his sled. But this ritual was more than just a memory. It was an act of imaginative will. In that moment, he wasn't the man confined to a wheelchair, his legs shrunken and useless from a battle with polio fought 2 decades earlier. He wasn't the leader of a nation teetering on the brink of history's greatest conflict. For a few brief moments, he was free. He could climb a hill. He could run. That man was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And on that particular night, as he performed his ritual, a phone call came that would change everything. Hitler's armies were pouring into Holland, Belgium, and France. The so-called phony war was over. The real war had begun. What you're about to hear is a story about that moment and all the moments that followed. It's a story drawn from the Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece by Doris Kearns Goodwin, No Ordinary Time. This isn't just a book about battles and strategies. It's an intimate journey into the heart of the White House during World War II, a place that became less like a seat of government and more like a small, crowded, and emotionally complicated hotel. It's the story of how a man who could not walk led a nation to run. It's the story of his wife, Eleanor, a woman who transformed the ceremonial role of First Lady into a powerful platform for justice, becoming the conscience of the country when it was needed most. And it is the story of their strange, fractured, yet profoundly effective partnership, a marriage that had been irrevocably broken years before, yet somehow provided the foundation for a leadership that saved the world. By the end of our time together, you will understand how America, a nation crippled by a decade of depression and fiercely isolationist, transformed itself into the arsenal of democracy. And you will see, through the lives of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, that true leadership isn't about being perfect or flawless. It's about finding strength in imperfection, and inspiring a nation to do the same. This, as the title suggests, was no ordinary time. And these were no ordinary people. Book summary. To truly understand Franklin Roosevelt, you have to begin with the one fact he worked so hard to conceal: his paralysis. Stricken with polio at the age of 39, a man who had loved to swim, sail, and run was now trapped in a body that wouldn't obey him. But the disease that crippled his body expanded his mind. His wife, Eleanor, called it his trial by fire. Those who knew him before and after said he emerged from the ordeal a different man, less arrogant, more empathetic, with a deeper understanding of human suffering. He couldn't go out into the world anymore, so he brought the world to him. And that is why the wartime White House was such an unusual place. It wasn't just the home of the first family, it was a residence, a command center, and a boarding house all in one. On the second floor, in the Lincoln Suite, lived Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor. Hopkins was a sickly, skeletal figure, a former social worker who had run the New Deal's massive relief programs. He was a man who looked, as one observer put it, like an ill-fed horse at the end of a hard day. Yet when he spoke, his eyes lit up, and Roosevelt saw in him a brilliant mind and an unwavering loyalty. Hopkins became, for all intents and purposes, FDR's alter ego. Down the hall lived Missy LeHand, the president's personal secretary. A handsome, intelligent woman, she had devoted her entire adult life to Franklin. She organized his hobbies, played his favorite games, and understood his moods in a way few others could. To many in the White House, she was the other wife, providing the easy, laughing companionship that had long since faded from his marriage. And then there was Eleanor. She and Franklin occupied adjoining suites, but their lives often ran on separate tracks. Their marriage had been fundamentally altered in 1918 when Eleanor discovered Franklin's love affair with her own social secretary, a beautiful woman named Lucy Mercer. The discovery shattered Eleanor's world. Though she agreed to stay with him for the sake of their children and his political career, she offered him a divorce, and when he refused, their intimate life together came to an end. But that heartbreak became the catalyst for her own liberation. No longer defining herself solely as a wife and mother, Eleanor began to build a life of her own. She became a teacher, a political organizer, and a powerful advocate for the poor and disenfranchised. By the time Franklin became president, she had forged a new kind of partnership with him. He was paralyzed, unable to travel easily. So she became his eyes and ears, journeying into the coal mines of Appalachia, the slums of Puerto Rico, and the migrant camps of California, bringing back to him the human stories he could no longer see for himself. This was the strange, interconnected family that occupied the White House in May of 1940, when the phone call came. Hitler was on the march. The period of quiet dread was over, and a full-blown crisis was at hand. And America was woefully unprepared. As Hitler's panzers sliced through France, the United States Army ranked just 18th in the world, behind not only the major powers but also countries like Portugal and Switzerland. The military was so starved for funds that soldiers trained with broomsticks for rifles and trucks labeled tank for tanks. The nation's spirit was just as weak. A powerful wave of isolationism swept the country, with many Americans, led by the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, arguing that the oceans would protect them and that Europe's war was not their own. This was the first great challenge for Roosevelt, to lead a nation that did not want to be led. He knew he couldn't get too far ahead of public opinion. He'd seen what happened to President Wilson and his failed League of Nations. So he began to move carefully, one step at a time, like a juggler keeping multiple balls in the air. He gave a powerful speech to Congress, calling for the production of an astonishing 50,000 airplanes a year, a number so large it seemed impossible, but it was designed to awaken the nation's industrial imagination. He knew that the only way to build that arsenal was to bring American business on board. For years, business leaders had been his fiercest critics, calling him a traitor to his class for the New Deal's regulations and support for labor unions. They called him that man in the White House, refusing even to say his name. But now, Roosevelt set aside the old fights. He reached out to the heads of General Motors and U.S. Steel, men like William Knudsen, and brought them into the government to run the mobilization effort. It was a truce, an uneasy alliance between the New Deal and big business. But it was a political necessity. Roosevelt understood that in a capitalist country, you couldn't fight a war without the full force of its industry. At the same time, he reassured his liberal base that he wouldn't abandon the social gains of the New Deal. He brought labor leader Sidney Hillman into the new Defense Commission, right alongside the corporate titans. It was a classic Roosevelt move. Create a structure with built-in competition, place yourself at the center, and retain all the final authority. When Knudsen asked, "Who is my boss?" Roosevelt replied with a simple smile, "I guess I am." While Franklin was juggling businessmen and generals, Eleanor was on a different mission. As her husband's focus shifted to the war, she felt a familiar sense of being left out, her concerns for social reform pushed to the side. But she soon found a new, vital role for herself. She argued, passionately and relentlessly, that the war would not be worth winning if America did not live up to its own democratic ideals at home. While Franklin was focused on the arsenal of democracy, she was focused on its soul. This mission brought her into the heart of the fight for racial justice. In 1941, the American military was almost entirely segregated. There wasn't a single black soldier in the Marine Corps or the Army Air Corps. In the Navy, black men could only serve as mess attendants, shining shoes and serving food to white officers. The booming defense industries were just as bad, openly refusing to hire black workers for anything other than janitorial jobs. A powerful and dignified labor leader named A. Philip Randolph decided that enough was enough. He called for 100,000 black Americans to march on Washington to demand an end to discrimination in defense jobs and the military. The administration was terrified. A march of that scale could cause riots, embarrass the country in front of the world, and shatter national unity. They turned to the one person they knew had the trust of the black community, Eleanor Roosevelt. She met with Randolph, pleading with him to call off the march, warning him of the potential for violence. Randolph respected her, but he stood firm. He told her that the black community was done with promises. They needed action. Eleanor carried that message back to her husband. It was a pivotal moment. Cornered, and with Eleanor acting as the crucial bridge, Roosevelt made a historic decision. He signed Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense industries and creating the Fair Employment Practices Commission (FEPC). It was the most significant federal action on civil rights since the Emancipation Proclamation. Randolph called off the march. He had won a massive victory without a single person ever setting foot on Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a lesson in the power of organized protest, a lesson that would echo through the civil rights movement for decades to come. Through all this, Roosevelt was still walking a tightrope with the American public. He pushed through the first peacetime draft in American history, a move so controversial it passed the House by a single vote. He engineered the destroyers for bases deal with Britain, trading 50 old American warships for naval bases on British territory, a move his opponents called an act of war. Then came his masterstroke, Lend-Lease. By the end of 1940, Britain was running out of money. It could no longer pay for the weapons it desperately needed. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, America would be next. But the isolationists in Congress would never approve an outright loan. During a quiet cruise on the presidential yacht, Roosevelt came up with a brilliantly simple analogy. He explained it at a press conference. "Suppose my neighbor's home catches on fire," he said, "and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him put out the fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." And with that simple story, the idea of Lend-Lease was born. America would lend weapons to the Allies, and after the war, they would be returned or replaced. It was, as Winston Churchill would later call it, the most unsorted act in the history of any nation, and it effectively made America the arsenal of democracy, even as it remained, officially, at peace. That precarious peace was shattered on the morning of December 7, 1941. Roosevelt was in his study with Harry Hopkins, relaxing after lunch, when the Secretary of the Navy called. "Mr. President," he said, "it looks like the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Hopkins couldn't believe it. But Roosevelt knew it was true. In that moment, his face set into what Eleanor called his deadly calm look. The years of debate, of juggling, of indecision were over. He called in his secretary, Grace Tully, and began to dictate the speech he would deliver to Congress the next day. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, he began, a date which will live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor united America overnight. The isolationist movement collapsed. The nation that had been so reluctant to enter the fight was now consumed by a singular purpose. The transformation was staggering. The auto industry, which had resisted conversion, shut down civilian car production entirely. Factories that once made corsets now made grenade belts. A pinball machine company started making armor-piercing shells. And a new kind of worker emerged, Rosie the Riveter. With millions of men going off to war, women poured into the factories. They learned to weld, to rivet, to operate massive cranes. For many, it was the first time they had ever earned their own paycheck, the first time they had experienced the freedom and camaraderie of the workplace. Eleanor championed this movement. "If I were of a debutante age," she said, "I would go into a factory, any factory where I could learn a skill and be useful." But this social revolution created new problems. With mothers at work, who would care for the children? Eleanor became a tireless advocate for government-sponsored daycare centers. She pushed industrialists like Henry Kaiser to build state-of-the-art facilities right next to his shipyards, complete with nurses, nutritionists, and even a service that provided hot meals for mothers to take home after their shifts. It was a vision of a supportive society that was decades ahead of its time. As the home front roared to life, the war front was still a place of darkness and defeat. In the Pacific, the Japanese swept through the Philippines, Singapore, and Burma. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. It was during these bleak months that Winston Churchill arrived at the White House for a 3-week stay at Christmas in 1941. His presence electrified the capital. He was a force of nature, a man who worked all night, napped in the afternoon, and drank brandy before breakfast. He and Roosevelt would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, spreading maps across the floor, planning grand strategy. Eleanor watched them with a worried eye. They were, she thought, like two little boys playing soldier. She saw in Churchill a romantic vision of war that frightened her. She worried that Franklin, caught up in the adventure of it all, would lose sight of the human cost. And the human cost was immense. In the major conferences that followed, at Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill, later joined by the formidable Joseph Stalin, made the decisions that would shape the world. They agreed to demand unconditional surrender. They argued over the timing of the Second Front in Europe, the D-Day invasion that Stalin desperately needed to relieve the pressure on his armies. Through it all, Roosevelt played the role of mediator, the charming host who believed he could win over the brutal Soviet dictator with sheer force of personality. At Tehran, he made a point of gently teasing Churchill in front of Stalin, creating a little club of two to break down the Russian leader's suspicion. It was a performance, a calculated act of political seduction, and it seemed to work. Roosevelt secured from Stalin the two things he needed most: a firm commitment to the D-Day invasion and a promise to enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. But the strain of these global responsibilities was taking a terrible toll. By the spring of 1944, those closest to the president saw alarming signs of his decline. He had lost weight, his skin was gray, and his hands trembled. A persistent cough racked his body. His daughter, Anna, now living in the White House to help him, was so worried she insisted on a full medical examination. The diagnosis was devastating. Roosevelt was suffering from congestive heart failure and advanced cardiovascular disease. The doctors gave him a secret, grim prognosis: he might not live out his 4th term. A conspiracy of silence descended upon the White House. The public was told he had a simple case of bronchitis. Even Eleanor, busy with her own relentless schedule, was not fully informed. She still saw him, in some ways, as the man who had conquered polio. She couldn't, or wouldn't, see that this was a battle he could not win. It was Anna who stepped in to fill the void. She became her father's gatekeeper, his confidant, his companion. She understood, in a way her mother could not, his deep need for simple, uncritical affection and relaxation. And it was Anna who made a decision that would have profound consequences. She knew her father was lonely. She knew that despite all the people surrounding him, he felt a deep, inner isolation. And she knew there was one person from his past who had always brought him uncomplicated joy: Lucy Mercer. Winthrop Rutherford, Lucy's husband, had died. Anna, acting out of compassion for her fading father, quietly arranged for Lucy to visit the White House when Eleanor was away. She would join them for dinner in his study, creating an atmosphere of light-hearted gaiety. Franklin seemed to come alive in her presence, the years falling away. It was a quiet, gentle end to a love story that had begun 3 decades earlier. While her father found solace in the past, Eleanor was looking to the future. In the summer of 1943, she undertook a grueling 5-week tour of the South Pacific, visiting American troops in hospitals and on remote island bases. Admiral Halsey, the gruff commander of the region, initially opposed the trip, seeing it as a distraction. But he was won over by her tireless energy and her genuine compassion. He watched as she walked through ward after ward of horribly wounded men, stopping at every single bed, not as a first lady, but as an American mother. "It was a sight I will never forget," he said later. He was so moved, he broke his own rule and allowed her to fly to the dangerous, recently secured island of Guadalcanal. It was there, in a dusty tent, that she had a brief, emotional reunion with a young soldier named Joe Lash, a former student activist whom she had taken under her wing. Their friendship was deep and complex, another of the intimate, non-traditional relationships that sustained Eleanor through her lonely years in the White House. By the spring of 1944, Roosevelt knew he was running out of time, but he felt he had to run for a 4th term. The war was not yet won, and the fragile architecture of the United Nations had yet to be built. He needed one last burst of energy. He found it in the campaign. In a driving rainstorm in New York City, he rode for 4 hours in an open car, waving to millions of people, defying the Republican whispers about his health. That night, he gave a masterful speech, full of humor and fight. He famously mocked the Republicans for attacking not just him, his family, or his policies, but even his little dog, Fala. The crowd roared. The old master, as reporters called him, still had it. He won the election handily. On the morning of D-Day, June 6, 1944, as hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, Roosevelt did not make a speech about victory or vengeance. Instead, he went on the radio and led the nation in a simple, humble prayer he had written himself. "Almighty God," he began, "our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity." The end, when it came, was quiet and sudden. In April of 1945, Roosevelt went to his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest. He was working on a speech, sitting in his favorite armchair by the fire, while Elizabeth Shumatoff, an artist, painted his portrait. Lucy Rutherford was there, sitting quietly on a sofa nearby. Suddenly, the president raised his hand to his head. "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," he said softly. Then he slumped forward. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. A few hours later, at 3:35 p.m. on April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead. Eleanor was in Washington when she got the call. She flew down to Georgia that night. It was there, in the small, quiet cottage, that she learned from her cousins that Lucy had been with Franklin when he died. And it was there that she learned her own daughter, Anna, had arranged the visits. Eleanor gave no outward sign of the pain this final betrayal must have caused. All her life, she had been trained to conceal her deepest emotions behind a facade of composure. As she lay in her berth on the funeral train, traveling north through the night, she looked out the window. All along the tracks, in the cities and at the lonely country crossroads, thousands of Americans stood silently, their faces filled with grief, waiting to pay their last respects. Men held their hats over their hearts. Women wept openly. "I lay in my berth all night with the window shade up," she later wrote, looking out at the countryside he had loved and watching the faces of the people who came to pay their last tribute all through the night. She was returning to Washington to pack up 12 years of a life she had shared with her husband. When she finally arrived at her apartment in New York, reporters were waiting. They asked her what her plans were. She looked at them, her face weary but composed, and said, "The story is over." But, of course, it wasn't. For Eleanor, a new life was just beginning. And for America, a new country was being born, a country forged in the crucible of no ordinary time. Commentary. When you close a book like No Ordinary Time, it's hard to know where to begin processing it all. It's more than just a history, it's a profound study of leadership, partnership, and national transformation. Doris Kearns Goodwin doesn't just give us the facts of the war, she invites us into the living rooms, the bedrooms, and the private thoughts of the people who guided America through its most perilous hour. And what do we find there? We find that leadership is a deeply human endeavor. Franklin Roosevelt was not a god on a pedestal. He was a man with profound physical weaknesses and personal failings. He could be devious, manipulative, and at times, emotionally distant even to those who loved him most. But Goodwin shows us that his power didn't come from being flawless. It came from his unshakable confidence, a confidence born from his own personal victory over polio, and his almost mystical connection with the American people. He believed in them, and in turn, they believed in him. He understood that in a democracy, you cannot lead by command alone. You have to bring people along with you, one step, one story, one fireside chat at a time. And then there is Eleanor. Her journey is, in many ways, the emotional core of the book. It's a story of turning profound personal pain into immense public purpose. The discovery of Franklin's affair could have destroyed her. Instead, it freed her. It allowed her to build an identity separate from him, to find her own voice. And that voice became the conscience of the nation. While Franklin focused on the political and military necessities of winning the war, Eleanor never let him, or the country, forget why they were fighting, for a more just, more equal, and more humane world. Their partnership is one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. It was not a traditional marriage. It was fractured, complicated, and often lonely for both of them. Yet, it worked. They complemented each other perfectly. He was the masterful politician, the charming commander-in-chief. She was the tireless advocate, the moral compass. He held the levers of power. She held the hearts of the people who had been forgotten. Together, they formed a leadership team unlike any other in American history. So, what can a young person, standing on the threshold of their own life, take away from this epic story? First, understand that your greatest strength can often grow from your greatest weakness. Roosevelt's paralysis forced him to develop his mind, his empathy, and his unique style of leadership. Eleanor's painful, lonely childhood gave her a profound connection to the suffering of others. Don't run from your struggles. They may be the very things that forge your character and give you your unique purpose. Second, recognize the power of partnership. Very few great things are accomplished alone. The Roosevelt story shows that a partnership doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful. Find people who complement your skills, who challenge your thinking, and who share your ultimate values, even if your methods are different. And finally, believe in the power of transformation. In 1940, America was a broken, divided, and fearful nation. 5 years later, it was the most powerful and prosperous country on earth. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because its leaders called upon the dormant energies of its people and challenged them to do the impossible. The story of the home front is a powerful reminder that in times of crisis, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. It's a reminder that a nation's character, like an individual's, is not revealed in easy times, but in the face of great adversity. That was a summary of No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only be a map. The real treasure is found in the journey itself. The true magic of this book is in Goodwin's masterful storytelling, in the quiet, intimate moments that reveal the humanity behind the history. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time and attention. If any part of this story has sparked your curiosity or touched your heart, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that can genuinely deepen your understanding of leadership, resilience, and the soul of a nation. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.